Okay, so you want to own an AI data center. Somewhere between $50 billion and $60 billion. That's what NVIDIA's own CEO, Jensen Huang, says it costs to stand up 1 gigawatt of AI infrastructure. Real number, not marketing. And right now, the 4 largest tech companies on Earth are trying to build the equivalent of that, in some form, every single year for the rest of the decade. Here's the promise. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how the money moves through an AI data center. Who pays for the building, who pays for the chips inside it, who actually collects a profit, and who is quietly holding a bag that could be empty in 3 years. Because this isn't a normal infrastructure story. It's a multi-trillion-dollar bet with an expiration date built into every piece of hardware inside it. And the part almost nobody explains, the part that decides whether you get rich or get wiped out, is what happens the moment those chips stop being the newest chips. First, the shell, the actual building. Here's what's coming. 3 numbers that explain almost the entire AI infrastructure boom, and 1 hidden cost that turns an exciting investment into a stalled one. A standard data center, the kind that's quietly run cloud storage and web hosting for the last 15 years, costs somewhere between $10 and $13 million per megawatt to build. Concrete, steel, diesel generators, central air conditioning. Nothing that would surprise a commercial contractor from 1995. An AI-optimized facility is not that building. A conventional server rack pulls 5 to 10 kilowatts of power. A rack packed with NVIDIA GPUs pulls 40, 60, sometimes past 100 kilowatts, closer to what you'd expect from an industrial furnace than an office park. Central air can't pull that heat out fast enough, so the industry moved to liquid cooling pipe directly to the chip. That single change cascades into reinforced flooring, a completely rebuilt electrical distribution system, and redundancy requirements that barely existed 5 years ago. Break the budget into its parts, and 3 cost drivers explain almost all of it. First, electrical systems, transformers, switchgear, backup generation, which eat 40 to 45% of the total on their own. Second, cooling, now 15 to 25% of the budget, up sharply from the days when a few rooftop units did the job. Third, redundancy, paying for a facility that never fully goes offline. Moving from a standard setup to the highest reliability tier adds another 25 to 40% by itself. Insurance against downtime, priced into the concrete before a single server arrives. Added up, and shell and core construction for an AI-optimized facility runs $15 to $20 million per megawatt in 2026 before a single chip is installed. Layer in the GPUs, the networking, and the fit-out, and the fully built cost climbs to $30 to $40 million per megawatt. That's the full package Huang was pricing at $50 to $60 billion per gigawatt. His own hardware, he said, accounts for well over half of it. Here's the part that should actually worry you if you're the one financing this. In 2025, developer-related Digital announced an Oracle data center campus in Saline Township, Michigan, with an estimated price tag of $7 billion. When the company actually secured financing in April 2026, the number had become $16 billion. More than double in under a year. Nobody involved would explain the gap publicly, on the record. That's not an isolated screw-up. It's the pattern. Land near the substations everyone wants has jumped 23% in a single year. Transformers, the unglamorous steel boxes that step voltage down to something a building can use, now carry lead times measured in years, not months. And permitting timelines for new power connections keeps stretching, adding months, sometimes years, onto projects that were supposed to finish on a fixed construction schedule. So here's the reframe. The shell isn't the hard part of owning an AI data center. It's expensive, tens of millions of dollars per megawatt, sometimes double the original budget. But it's a construction problem, and construction problems, however painful, eventually resolve. What might not resolve is everything the building actually needs in order to turn on. Second, power, and here's what's coming. The real reason a meaningful share of announced AI data center capacity may never actually get built. Goldman Sachs projects U.S. data center power demand climbing from 31 gigawatts in 2025 to 66 gigawatts by 2027, more than doubling in 2 years. Data centers already accounted for roughly half of all U.S. electricity demand growth last year. And here's the cost of ignoring this if you're the one trying to power a new facility. Of every project that entered a U.S. grid interconnection queue between 2000 and 2019, only 13% actually reached commercial operation. 77% withdrew, not from lack of capital, but because they could never get connected. The queue now runs roughly 5 years from application to energization. Actual construction of the building itself takes 18 to 30 months. You can finish the concrete and the switchgear years before the utility can legally give you a single electron. It isn't free for the neighbors either. In the PJM region around Washington, D.C., the highest concentration of data centers on Earth, capacity market prices jumped from $30 per megawatt day in late 2024 to over $300 today, with costs already trickling down to residential bills. One projection has the average Virginia household's monthly electric bill climbing from $143 today to $315 by 2039, driven largely by data center demand on the same grid. So the biggest technology companies on Earth stopped waiting in line. They started buying power plants directly. In September 2024, Microsoft signed a 20-year power purchase agreement with Constellation Energy to restart 3 Mile Island. Not the reactor that partially melted down in 1979, but Unit 1 next door, which ran safely for decades until it was shut down in 2019 for being unprofitable next to cheap natural gas. Microsoft is now paying roughly $1.6 billion, backed by $1 billion federal loan, to bring it back from the dead, renamed the Crane Clean Energy Center. In exchange, Microsoft gets 100% of the plant's output, 835 megawatts, enough for 800,000 homes, locked in for 20 straight years. Amazon did its own version, buying a data center campus next to the Susquehanna nuclear plant in Pennsylvania for $650 million and locking up 960 megawatts. Google contracted for small modular reactors from Kairos Power. Meta put out a request for proposals covering up to 4 gigawatts of new nuclear capacity entirely on its own. None of this is really about being green. It's about being certain. Solar and wind are cheap, but they go quiet exactly when a training cluster needs power most, at 2 a.m. mid-run with nowhere to pause. Nuclear doesn't sleep. 3 Mile Island's Unit 1 ran at 96.3% uptime in its best years. For a facility where an hour of downtime can cost millions of dollars, that reliability is worth paying almost any price to lock in, which flips the entire ownership question upside down. A building can be replicated anywhere there's flat land, a willing contractor, and enough money. A 20-year lock on 800 megawatts of nuclear baseload cannot be replicated. There are only so many power plants, and everyone with capital wants the same ones. The building is a commodity. The power contract is the asset. Third, the layer that actually decides whether any of this makes money. Here's what's coming. You've built the shell, you've locked the power. Now comes the part that turns a building into a business, the compute itself. According to Epic AI's cost breakdown of a typical 1 gigawatt AI facility, servers and GPUs make up roughly 60% of the total cost of ownership. More than the building, more than the power infrastructure, more than everything else combined. A 1 gigawatt facility carries an estimated $38 billion in upfront capital spending and close to $1 billion a year just to keep running. And here's what it costs you to misunderstand this layer. This is where the actual profit or the actual collapse happens. Get the building wrong and you're over budget. Get this layer wrong and the entire investment can go to zero. A new category of company was built specifically to run this layer. They're called neoclouds, and the largest one, CoreWeave, is the cleanest window into how the business actually works and how fragile it is underneath the growth numbers. If the way money actually moves through an industry is more interesting to you than the headlines about it, get subscribed before we keep going. It's the easiest way to catch the next one of these. Anyway, Here's CoreWeave's model piece by piece. CoreWeave usually doesn't own the shell. It leases a powered building from a developer, one of those $10 to $13 million per megawatt facilities, at roughly $1.65 million per megawatt in year one, climbing 3% annually, plus a one-time fit-out cost of around $75 million per 100 megawatts. Then it spends the real money, buying NVIDIA GPUs outright and locking in 3 to 5 year rental contracts with customers, often before the GPU order is even placed. That structure explains the growth curve. CoreWeave's revenue went from $1.9 billion in 2024 to over $5.1 billion in 2025, nearly tripling. Adjusted EBITDA margin, 60%. 60 cents of every revenue dollar becomes cash profit before interest and depreciation touch it. On paper, that's one of the best margin businesses in the country. Then look at the actual bottom line. Net loss in 2024, $863 million. Net loss in 2025, $1.17 billion. Wider, not narrower, even as revenue nearly tripled. The gap is depreciation and interest on tens of billions of dollars in debt, collateralized by GPUs that start losing relevance the moment NVIDIA ships its next chip. And through most of this growth, 60 to 70% of CoreWeave's revenue has come from a single customer, Microsoft. CoreWeave isn't the exception. It's the template. Lambda, Nebius, Crusoe, every neocloud runs some version of the same trade. Borrow heavily against hardware that depreciates fast, lock in a handful of enormous customers, and bet that the rental income arrives faster than the chips go obsolete. The revenue in this layer is completely real. The profit is a bet against a clock that nobody inside the building actually controls. Fourth, follow the money all the way down, because most of the biggest numbers in this industry are promises, not payments. Here's what's coming. The actual size of the gap between what's been announced and what's actually changed hands. And here's why it matters to you. If you're evaluating any company in this space, as an investor, an employee, or just someone trying to figure out where your own money is safest, that gap is exactly where the risk is hiding. In January 2025, President Trump stood at the White House with OpenAI's Sam Altman, SoftBank's Masayoshi Son, and Oracle's Larry Ellison to announce Stargate. $500 billion, 10 gigawatts, over 4 years. On paper, the largest private infrastructure commitment in history. Here's what actually happened next. By early 2026, reporting showed the three-way joint venture behind Stargate had effectively stalled. Disagreements over control meant no staff had been hired and no shared entity had broken ground under its own name. Instead, OpenAI went around it. A bilateral $300 billion, 5-year deal directly with Oracle for 4.5 gigawatts, a separate site deal with SoftBank in Texas. The name Stargate survived. The unified $500 billion joint venture, as originally announced at that podium, largely didn't. Altman himself has since talked publicly about total compute commitments approaching $1.4 trillion over the next 8 years, against 2025 revenue estimated at only $3 to $4 billion. Meanwhile, the 4 largest hyperscalers alone are on pace to spend roughly $725 billion in AI capital expenditure this year. CoreWeave's own backlog, signed contracts for future revenue, hit $104 billion by mid-2026 against actual 2025 revenue of $5.1 billion. That's better than a 20-to-1 ratio between what's been promised on paper and what's actually been billed. Some of that promised money is startlingly circular. NVIDIA has committed up to $100 billion to OpenAI. NVIDIA separately signed a $6.3 billion agreement to lease back unsold CoreWeave capacity built with NVIDIA chips in the first place. NVIDIA sells the GPUs, invests in the companies buying them, and in some cases ends up renting the very compute those chips produce. Every dollar in that loop counts as revenue for somebody. It's often the same dollar, moving in a circle, making the entire industry look larger than the actual cash changing hands would suggest. None of this means the money is fake. A multi-year contract with Microsoft or Oracle is a real credit-backed commitment. But a signed contract and a wired payment are two different things. And in this industry, right now, the distance between them is measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. The $500 billion headline is what everyone agreed to promise in a room. The real economics live in what actually gets paid this quarter. Fifth, and this is the number that could break the entire model. How long does a GPU actually last? Here's what's coming. The single assumption that every dollar of profit we've talked about depends on. Here's the cost of getting it wrong. If this number is off by even a year or two, the earnings underneath the entire AI infrastructure trade don't shrink, they evaporate. Hyperscalers spread the cost of their AI hardware, depreciate it, over 4 to 6 years on their books. Between 2020 and 2024, most of them steadily extended those estimates. That trend broke in 2025. Amazon shortened the useful life of a subset of its servers, while Meta stretched its own schedule from 4.5 years to 5.5. A change that saved it $2.9 billion in 2025 alone, straight to the bottom line. Two companies pulling in opposite directions on the exact same underlying technology. In November 2025, Michael Burry, the investor who famously shorted the U.S. housing market before it collapsed in 2008, called this out in public. NVIDIA ships a new chip architecture roughly every year. Burry's argument: if the hardware is functionally obsolete in 2 to 3 years, but companies are spreading its cost over 5 or 6, they're understating real expenses and inflating real profits. His estimate: $176 billion in understated depreciation across the industry between 2026 and 2028. By his math, Oracle could be overstating earnings by close to 27%, Meta by close to 21%. He called it one of the more common frauds of the modern era. NVIDIA and CoreWeave both lost significant market value in the weeks that followed. CoreWeave stock fell more than 60% between June and December of 2025. The hyperscalers pushed back hard, and their argument isn't nothing. A GPU doesn't die the moment a newer model ships. It cascades. Cutting-edge training work today, inference work in a year, smaller and less demanding jobs after that. Genuinely useful for years after it stops being the fastest chip on the market. CoreWeave backed that argument with actual evidence in 2026. It disclosed a lease extension on NVIDIA, a 100 chips, hardware from 2020, running all the way through 2029. 9 years of revenue from a single purchase. Its CFO described the capacity coming up for renewal as a minimal portion of the fleet, with resale pricing sitting at or above historical peaks. So who's actually right? Nobody outside these companies fully knows, because none of them publish the underlying utilization data that would settle the argument for good. What's certain is this: every projection of profit in this industry, every valuation built on top of those profits, rests on a guess about how long a $30,000 chip stays useful. Right now, that number isn't a fact anyone can verify. It's a bet the entire industry is placing together without agreeing on the odds. Sixth, and this is the actual answer to the question you clicked on. If you had to own exactly one layer of this business, which layer would you actually want? Start with the company furthest into the compute layer at hyperscaler scale. Oracle, sitting on that $300 billion, 5-year contract with OpenAI. Reporting from the information, based on internal documents, found Oracle's gross margin across its AI infrastructure contracts averaging just 16%. On its most exposed deals, it struggled to clear 25%. That's razor thin for a company shouldering tens of billions of dollars in capital spending every year. And it's close to the same math problem CoreWeave is fighting with its own mountain of GPU-backed debt. Now look at the layer sitting underneath all of it, collecting rent regardless of how any of that plays out. When CoreWeave leases a shell at $1.65 million per megawatt with a 3% annual escalator, and you capitalize that income stream at a market yield of roughly 9.5%, the implied value of what the landlord bill comes out to nearly $21 million per megawatt. That landlord isn't betting on GPU pricing, isn't betting on chip obsolescence, isn't betting on whether OpenAI's revenue ever catches up to its spending. The landlord collects the rent whether the tenant's GPUs are printing money or gathering dust in a warehouse. Companies like Digital Realty, Equinix, and Vantage Data Centers sit in exactly this position. Real estate income, secured by long leases, spread across many tenants, with somebody else carrying all the technology risk. That's the actual split running through this entire industry. One layer, the GPUs, the NeoCloud contracts, the chip depreciation clock, behaves like venture capital. Enormous potential upside, and a real chance of getting wiped out by a hardware cycle nobody in that layer controls. The other layer, the land, the power contract, the shell itself, behaves like a bond. Slower, far less exciting. Paid whether the AI boom turns out to be real or turns out to be the most expensive infrastructure bubble in American history. The GPU business promises to make you rich. The real estate underneath, it just promises to still be standing either way. And that landlord logic, get paid by the tenant regardless of what they're building inside, isn't unique to a $16 billion AI campus. It scales all the way down to a fourplex on a normal street. Here's the surprising part. The small apartment building, the 4 to 20 unit kind almost nobody covers, actually produces some of the most resilient cash flow in all of real estate, better in many years than the trophy properties institutions fight over. And almost everyone who buys one gets the same single number wrong. The one number that quietly decides whether that building pays your mortgage or drains your bank account every month without you noticing until it's too late. That's next. The economics of owning a small apartment building. The exact math behind that number, and why it trips up first-time landlords more than any other mistake in real estate.